Hey everyone, Tactics here, continuing my Season 3 Dungeon Guide series where we've got a familiar one today with Priory of the Sacred Flame. Since this was also in the pool in Season 2, I'm not going to be going over every single detail here, just the most impactful changes, of which there are quite a few here in this dungeon over the course of the PTR, as well as just other important trash and boss abilities that you'll need to be aware of in case you didn't play this dungeon in Season 2, plus some tips and tricks that we did learn over the course of the season that you may not be aware of that will make your life easier this season. I do have a bunch of videos out already on the other dungeons in this season's pool over on my channel. Plus, I do have written guides if you're looking for more details on every single ability over on the Method website. You can find all that linked in the description below. Otherwise, let's hop into it. Where to start? There's been a bunch of tuning by Blizzard in order to try and encourage players to play the right side of the dungeon a bit more instead of the left. Starting out with the footmen, who are more prevalent on the right side than the left, but exist on both, they've caught a pretty hefty health nerf, but you'll still want to make sure that you are CCing them when they channel defend, as otherwise your pulls are going to be very long because of that damage reduction. The sharpshooters, again, present on both sides, but more prevalent on the right, have caught a nerf to their random target damage, as well as a buff to the count they provide. They're going to be a bit more value to fight. As a tip for these mobs, when they disengage, they will always do it towards a random player, so any ranged player should actually play in melee range of the pack in order to bait these guys either into the pack if they're not in it already, or prevent them from leaping too far out of the pack. One of the most dangerous mobs in this initial area are the Knights, and they've actually had a ton of nerfs to them, so their damage on both their Impale Bleed, which goes on your random target, as well as their Disrupting Shout AoE and Interrupt hit have both been slashed, and so while you're still going to be in danger if you have the Bleed and the Disrupting Shout at the same time, the overlap is much less dangerous and also happens less often because they've also slashed the duration on that Bleed a fair bit. On top of that, the count value has been buffed just like the sharpshooters here, and you actually might be able to cut out an entire pull if you add a couple knights to your route, which is pretty valuable. Then let's talk about the mini bosses and their corresponding boss lieutenants, which for those that don't know, there are 3 unique mobs spread throughout this first area, and you will need to kill 2 of them before fighting the first boss, as when you kill one, it will call away one of the boss's lieutenants, allowing you to fight them as trash mobs and removing their mechanics from the boss encounter. The third lieutenant will never leave the boss, meaning the 2 mini bosses that you kill impacts how your first boss goes. Starting with the first mini boss in the middle with Guard Captain Suleiman, this is one that you're pretty much always going to be killing here early on in the dungeon, and he just has a tank hit and large knockback and shield slam, as well as an AoE hit and slow in Thunderclap. For some tips, tanks, you can hold this mob either against some of the nearby stairs or up against a wall, and that actually will prevent the knockback entirely. Makes it a lot easier. You can keep the entire pack stationary. And for the Thunderclap, because it has a slow attached to it, you can use things like Blessing of Freedom, which prevents slows from going on to players, and that actually prevents the damage from this AoE hit entirely. So pretty useful, especially if you're playing a ret or prot paladin, which has double freedom. When this guy is killed, he spawns Sergeant Shane Mail, who just has a random target leap and AoE bleed, so make sure you are spread out here. And you can also use the braziers throughout this area and stand on them, and that prevents this charge from going out on you entirely. So a neat little tip here, just to be careful, as it does tend to bug out some of the other mobs in this area. Moving up the right side, there is Forge Master Damien. He caught even more nerfs going into Season 3, again with the goal of trying to convince people to actually fight him. First, his Heat Wave AoE hit no longer slows, instead it's just a relatively light magic dot on the group, so it's much easier to deal with his other mechanic, which occasionally spawns puddles on successful melee hits on the tank. This ability has also had a drastic cooldown increase, so there's going to be a lot less puddles overall compared to what people are used to if you played this dungeon at the beginning of Season 2. Plus, for tanks, if you're able to avoid melee swings, whether that be parrying or dodging, or you're able to immune the magic portion of this hit with something like AMS or bubble or spell warding, you actually prevent the puddles from spawning entirely. So this is another tip you can use to save space and make it easier for the rest of your group. After defeating the Forger Master, you'll face Elena Emberlands, who has a tank magic hit in Divine Judgment, as well as channeled group damage in Holy Radiance. Healers want to make sure that you throw out a Dispel on the tank whenever this Divine Judgment goes out, and make sure you have healing prep for that Holy Radiance, so this was also one of the things that got nerfed a little bit here going into this season. Now, for the left side, this was the more popular route in Season 2, which involved you taking on High Priest Amia, who is a caster, so you need to keep interrupts on her random target smite. Otherwise, she would occasionally throw up an absorb shield that reflects some incoming damage back at players, so sometimes if you're too bursty, you may need to press defensive on this. She's mostly unchanged, however, they did buff the size of her shield, making her a bit slower to kill and potentially make it easier to actually hurt yourself on that damage reflects. So she's going to be a bit slower. Overall, I think the right side is certainly more appealing now. I'm not going to say it's a guaranteed right side season, but I think it's pretty likely, especially in comps that have a lot of melee kicks, to handle the last boss lieutenant spawned by High Priest Amia, Tainer Duelmaw. If you were going right, this is the guy that's going to be on the boss. He got an interrupt in some random target bolts. He had a second interrupt previously in Season 2. That's been removed. The tank stun is gone. Just these bolts to deal with. And he will also occasionally spawn a bunch of swirlies under players with Ember Storm. This used to be a very bad overlap with the first boss if you ever did them together. That's also been fixed going into the season as they dropped the duration on this to just 4 seconds. And they also added a grace period between the boss casting their individual leap ability and this, so there's never going to be an overlap with swirlies falling when someone gets CC'd. Before getting into the boss though, reminder, there is a priest and paladin buff in this dungeon. You can interact with the golden orb either in that first courtyard you enter in or in the last boss room, and this will buff the attacks of all nearby allies, causing them to deal bonus holy damage. Not a huge buff, but a nice little boost that you can pick up right at the start of the dungeon, and while it is lost on death, the orbs themselves always stick around, so you can interact with them again to rebuff anyone who needs it. Now let's talk Captain Dailcry, who as previously mentioned will be joined by a lieutenant who shares damage. No matter who you hit here, you are damaging the boss, so feel free to cleave. While the lieutenant does have significantly more health than the boss, you do not need to worry about killing them as they will just despawn once Dailcry is defeated. Now, in terms of abilities, there is something new here, as the previous random target line attack has been replaced with Earth-Shattering Spear. This is an 8-yard AoE underneath a random player and then leaves behind a puddle for 2 minutes, as well as doing a hit of raid damage that is unavoidable, so some additional healing requirements on this boss, as well as area denial that will force you to use this whole area the boss spawns in. Outside of that, the nasty tank bleed in Pierce armor has had its duration slashed to the joy of tanks everywhere, so this fight's going to be a bit easier on your tank, but you still will need to plan out your defensives for all of these hits. For other players' defensives, you want to use them if you get targeted by Savage Mauling, and when this happens, make sure everyone is hitting the boss specifically to break that shield and end the channel ASAP. You can also use combat drops here to break that channel early as well. You also need to make sure that you assign one kick to the boss to prevent that battle cry from buffing the lieutenant mob. If you went right, you're going to have Tainer with the boss, so as previously mentioned, keep interrupts on him, watch your feet for swirlies, and this is never going to overlap with that Savage Mauling now, which is nice. Also fairly forgiving if you miss a kick or two, as long as it's not a really bad overlap, and if it is, you can press a defensive. If you went left, you're going to have Emberlands with the boss, meaning tanks will also need to be aware of her additional magic hit, and healers will need to be ready to dispel it quickly, especially if it overlaps with a bleed. Plus, they will need to make sure they prep healing for her channeled damage. For positioning, I recommend staying together as a group and moving as one whenever a circle spawns. This is the best for conserving space, as you know always where the circles are going to be. Plus, it keeps the bosses together for when Savage Mauling goes out, meaning you can cleave that shield down easier and free that player quickly. After bringing Dailcry and his lieutenant down, you'll face a couple waves of trash mobs before the second boss. Nothing here has really changed. There's a few casters that shoot bolt at random players. Not too bad on their own, but can be scary whenever they overlap with the Ardent Paladin's group hit in Sacred Toll, so be careful and use defensives and healing cooldowns here as needed. Tanks, be aware of the Templars, as they have a couple different buffs that power up their melee swings. One of them is purgeable while the other is not, so just keep defensives rolling while they're buffed. Eventually, you'll be able to take on Baron Braunpyke, a fight that saw some changes throughout the course of Season 2, but is the same going into Season 3, though we have learned some tips to make him a bit easier. To start, you want to drag the boss to one side of the circle in the room and be stacked up to bait all the hammers of purity down into one spot. This is spinning hammers on 3 random players, so much like the first boss, if you're stacked, you know where they're going to be, and once they do spawn, you can run across the room out of range of the hammers. Shortly after creating these hammers, the boss will create a sacrificial pyre, which is a circle on the ground that must be soaked 3 times within 30 seconds, otherwise you wipe. Soaking it does a hit of group damage to your entire party and also applies a 15-second dot to the soaker specifically, so it is beneficial to either have your tank or more durable players soaking these pyres, or someone with an immunity like bubble or anti-magic shell. That being said, it's important not to rush the soaks here, because shortly after the pyre is created, the boss will do Castigator's Shield, hitting 3 random players with a decent upfront hit, as well as creating 12-yard AoEs around them that everyone will need to get out of. Basically, what you'll want to do is you'll want to move away from the hammers, like we talked about, and then you'll see where the pyre spawned, and instead of going to the pyre, you actually want to wait and bait away from the pyre, allowing those 12-yard AoEs to drop safely away from it, and then you as a group can move towards the pyre, which shouldn't be covered by those 12-yard AoEs because you baited away, and then you can begin soaking once people have been topped from that shield hit. You have 30 seconds total here. It's a ton of time. Do not rush those soaks. And you can even do things like have your tank take 2 soaks, wait for their 2 stack of the 15-second dot to expire with defensives rolling, and then they can take the last soak just to concentrate all that damage onto them. You can also do 2 soaks on the tank, 1 soak on someone else, whatever works for your group. While you're soaking, one player will also need to keep an eye on the boss here, because he does the Burning Light cast, which needs to be interrupted, otherwise the boss heals and does a big AoE hit, likely leading to a wipe. Now, all of this gets a bit more complicated when the boss casts Vindictive Wrath, as aside from increasing his melee damage, it also empowers one of his ability casts. For the hammers and the shields, this just causes the target count to go up from 3 to 5, but you'll still handle them the exact same as you're going to be stacked. For the pyre, this causes the charges to also go up from 3 to 5, so you'll need multiple players to actually pitch in to help soak this, or as previously mentioned, if you have immunities, you can save them specifically when you have a 5-charge pyre and have them soak up all of those dangerous dots. Other than that, the fight just repeats here with the exact same spell cadence, so you can just keep dancing accordingly. Moving up towards the last boss are many familiar mobs, though there's a couple that you might not have seen yet. Light spawn are sparse in the first area, but unavoidable up here, and they'll just channel damage into a random player with purification, so use a defensive or a combat drop like Meld or Feign Death to cancel that effect. These mobs also die in a burst of light at just 25% health, healing anything inside a 10-yard AoE after a few seconds, so be ready to move the pack here when these mobs start getting low, as you can lose a lot of time from this heal. For casters, there's a new priority in the Risen Mages, who just want to interrupt every single cast of Fireball Volley, and then any spare kicks can go into their random target Fireball. These mobs, as well as the Risen Footmen in this area, also have a passive in Light Expulsion, which causes them to do an AoE hit on death. As a tip, if you CC these mobs with something like a stun just before they die, this passive doesn't trigger at all, which saves you some damage intake. Outside of that, there's a mini boss in Sir Braunpyke up here, which constantly pulses for holy damage thanks to the Radiant Flame passive, making him very dangerous when combined with those light expulsion mobs we just mentioned. And honestly, this is not a bad mob to pop your Bloodlust on if you're not worried about the final boss. He's also got a dangerous tank hit in Blazing Strike, so tanks, you'll definitely want to make sure you have a defensive running for every cast of this. That brings us to Prioress Murrpray, which is 2 boss phases separated by a short intermission when you push the boss to 50% health. In both phases, the boss has the same abilities, with tank damage coming in the form of the Interruptible Holy Smite, and group damage mostly coming from her inner fire buff, which pulses every few seconds. On its own, this damage is not too bad, but when it overlaps with Blinding Light, it can get quite dangerous, so that's when you want to use defensives or group CDs. You also need to make sure that you turn away from the boss when Blinding Light is casted, otherwise you'll be blinded for a few seconds, so the healer can dispel you if you get caught. A little tip that we learned throughout Season 2 is that if you don't interrupt the boss in this first phase, you will never have Inner Fire overlap with Blinding Light, so basically you can take out some of the group damage and the scary overlaps for the party and put it into tank damage. On top of that, you are also able to line of sight the Blinding Light initial hit using the stairwells if you tank the boss where she spawns initially, so that potentially could save you a defensive use. Outside of this, the boss will attempt to purify a random player, calling down a beam that chases them and leaves behind puddles for a few seconds, so make sure you stay away from those, and also watch out for the holy flame circles that spawn under random players. Once the boss hits 50%, she stops whatever she's doing and she jumps to the upper platform, where she starts to channel Embrace the Light. Players need to chase her and break her shield to interrupt this channel and stop the heavy pulsing damage that it does. She'll also spawn waves of ads in this phase, so the faster you break this shield, the less ads you'll need to deal with. These mobs are quite dangerous as they fixate random players and deal pulsing damage thanks to overwhelming power, but that's also their weakness, as you can just kind of CC them away from your group using slows, knockbacks, and roots, and they'll just rot out on their own. You'll never need to swap to them. Another tip for this intermission, if you have your group all run up one side of the platform and then stay on that side of the upper platform when you're damaging the boss, it will actually bait all of the ads to follow on that side instead of be split across both sides, so they'll be stacked up and easy to hit with a single AoE CC. Once the shield is broken and the cast is interrupted, you're just fighting the boss on this upper platform. Though note that the ability timings here are a bit different, and that tip where you can avoid all of the bad inner fire overlaps no longer applies. But that is it, guys. All the changes and important things to note about Priory of the Sacred Flame going into Season 3. Hopefully this helps you out, and if it does, be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more content like it. Otherwise, need to give a massive thanks to all my Patreons for making all this content possible, and I'll see everyone in the next video.